today is people saying, please just put us back where we were before you came.
We're talking to Antonia Juhasz, author and activist, who wrote The Bush Agenda, Invading the World One Economy at a Time. Now gas is over $3 in many places. What's the connection?
Well, here's the connection. The Bush administration is the most beholden administration probably in American history to the oil and gas industry. This is the first time in history that the president, vice president, and secretary of state are all former energy company officials. In fact, both Bush and Rice have more experience as energy company officials than they do as government leaders. Cheney outbeats them. He spent 30 years working for government. However, his 5 years at Halliburton have been so profitable that you might say that his Halliburton years outweigh their oil years, because Bush was a very bad oil company executive. But their links to the oil sector are deep. The oil industry provided more than 13 times more money to the Bush-Cheney ticket in the first round of elections than it did to his competitor, 9 times more in the second. And this industry has been absolutely coddled by the Bush administration. Enormous tax subsidies, deregulation, and I would argue a war waged on their behalf. Now, there's two intimate connections between the war and the price of gas. But first, I think it's very important for people to understand that the vertical integration of the oil industry, which has been absolutely exacerbated under the Bush administration. For example, Chevron, Texaco, and Unocal merging into one company, the completion of Exxon and Mobil's merger, all of these little companies merging into enormous behemoths, so that you have ExxonMobil being the company that has received the highest profits of any company in the world over the last 2 years, ever in the history of the world. That is because of the vertical integration and monopoly power of these companies. That means that they control exploration, production, refining, marketing, and sales. The price of oil at the pump is about 50% the price of a barrel of oil, about 25% taxes, and then the rest is marketing and just the price determined by the company at the pump. So that means that about 18 to 20% is absolutely determined by the oil companies themselves and governed by the companies themselves. So they could reduce the price of oil and reduce their profit margin, or they could jack up the price of oil and increase their profit margin. They've chosen to do the latter. And one of the things that has helped them do that is, first of all, the United States is receiving a tremendous amount of oil from Iraq. Oil is down in overall export and production, but not tremendously so. We were, at pre-war, was 2.5 million barrels a day. We're now at about 2 or 2.2 million barrels a day. But 50% of that, on average, is coming to the United States. And it's being brought to the United States by Chevron and Exxon and Marathon. The myth of dramatically reduced supply has helped them create an argument to the American public, which is, it's a time of war, we're suffering, gas prices are going to go up, everyone needs to, come in and support this because this is war. Well, that's just not true. The companies are using that as a myth to help make it okay for them to receive these utterly ridiculous profits. In your chapter, A Mutual Seduction, you have a quote of Ken Durr, the former CEO of Chevron, 1998. I know his tenure well. It was the time in the Niger Delta that Chevron was involved with the killing of 2 Nigerian villagers who were protesting yet another oil spill of Chevron and jobs not being given to the local community as they drilled for oil. But your quote here says, Iraq possesses huge reserves of oil and gas, reserves I'd love Chevron to have access to. And then you follow that with a quote of John Gibson, chief executive of Halliburton Energy Service Group, who says, we hope Iraq will be the first domino and that Libya and Iran will follow. We don't like being kept out of markets because it gives our competitors an unfair advantage. I love it when they're honest. It doesn't happen very often. These companies have been explicit for decades that they want in, particularly to Iraq. The reason is obvious. Iraq certainly has the second largest oil reserves in the world, but some geologists believe it has the largest, at least on par with Saudi Arabia. That's a tremendous pool of wealth. And not just have the companies been clear that they want access to that oil. U.S. leaders, for example, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Zalmay Khalilzad, Donald Rumsfeld have all been explicit for the past 20 years that what the U.S. needs to do is gain increased access to the region's oil, and most explicitly during the 90s, Iraq's oil, that this is something that shouldn't be in the hands of Saddam Hussein. The difference going into the current Bush administration was that the rhetoric changed to, and the reality changed, to not just we need a new leader, we need a fully new political and economic structure in Iraq, and we need to be in that country to make sure that that structure gets put into place. And that is exactly what they have achieved. And now Halliburton, Chevron, Bechtel, Lockheed Martin have profited tremendously from this process already. I mean, Chevron's, well, the U.S. value of Iraqi oil, imported Iraqi oil, has increased by 86% between 2003 and 2004. Those profits have gone to Exxon, Chevron, and Marathon. Chevron has seen its most profitable years in its entire 125-year history over the last 2 years. They're making out like bandits. They have been at the forefront of advocating for decades for increased U.S. economic access to Iraq. And now they're one of the few companies that are poised, once the new oil law is implemented, and that oil law has its history in the U.S. State Department, in the Iraqi Oil and Energy Working Group that formed right before the war. A member of that working group, whose last name is Aloum, and I'm blanking on his first name, became oil minister of Iraq. He's the man who eviscerated all of the pre-existing oil contracts that Saddam Hussein had signed. At the end of Saddam Hussein's tenure, he had signed about 30 contracts with companies from all around the world to give them access to Iraq's oil sector. None of those contracts were with the United States or U.S. oil companies. The Cheney Energy Task Force that met at the very beginning of the Bush administration mapped out foreign suitors to Iraqi oil, listed all of the companies, all of the countries, the fields that they had access to, within a document that said the U.S. needs to get greater access to Middle East oil.
Can you tell us who Cheney met with?
Cheney met with, thank goodness for the Supreme Court that ruled to release these documents, because otherwise they were completely secret. He met with Bechtel, Chevron, Halliburton, Exxon, all of the largest oil companies, and all of the largest oil engineering companies. And they decided we need to increase our access to Middle Eastern oil. Aloum then became Iraq's oil minister.
Ibrahim Bar al-Aloum.
Thank you very much.
From your book.
From my book. It's good to remember what's in my book. Canceled all of the pre-existing oil contracts. Now, Abd el-Mahdi has said several times the new oil law, when it's put in place, is going to be very good for U.S. oil companies. Chevron, Exxon, the other companies are sort of hovering on the outside. They've signed what are called memoranda of understanding, essentially free services. Chevron's been training Iraqi workers in the United States for years, doing mappings, free services, so that they are ready when the permanent government is in place to sign contracts. And then, I believe, once those contracts are signed, they will get to work, but they need security. And what better security force than 150,000 American troops? And I do not think that those troops will leave unless we all have something to do about it until the oil companies are safely at work.
In our next segment, we're going to talk about the protest in this country. But I wanted to ask you about Henry Kissinger and his role in this.
Well, Henry Kissinger is a fascinating character in all realms. He's been fascinating for me to follow because in that chapter that you talk about the turning towards Iraq, I look at U.S. business interests and how they aggressively pursued a greater U.S. relationship with Iraq. Henry Kissinger founded Kissinger Associates the same year that Ronald Reagan opened up for the first time economic relationships between the United States and Iraq. Reagan was the hottest pursuer until George Bush Sr. came onto the team and really pushed for better relationships with Saddam Hussein. But Kissinger and Associates was a lead providing advice to multinational